This video is on the fabrication of a prototype crosscut sledge for a Bosch PPS 7S push-pull table saw. Designs based upon one called The Simplest Table Saw Crosscut Sledge on YouTube by Steve Ramsey, and this video details the differences required for the Bosch PPS 7S. Steve Ramsey's design for a conventional saw is shown in this web address here, and I would recommend that you view this video before starting to embark on making a sledge for the Bosch table saw. In terms of dimensions, he suggests it should be about 16 by 30 inches, which I agree with, and also should use 3/4 inch plywood, which I didn't use because I only had 1/2 inch available, and this has proved to be a problem because there seems to be some warpage on plywood. Anyway, the general dimensions work well for the PPS prototype. One thing you should remember is that you should check that any modifications you make don't violate any local safety regulations. Bit of background: prototype used materials available in the garage, so materials used were not necessarily optimal, and certainly making the initial design demonstrated why 3/4 inch ply is required. The saw guard has been upgraded a little bit from Steve's design, and in the final design the riving knife does not need to be adjusted for either sledge or standard mode of operation. It is really important to adjust the riving knife according to the manuals, and the height of the riving knife for the official design is set to the maximum height of the saw. This arrangement is not recommended. One final thing: you can use beeswax on the runners for smoother operation. The following slides show pictures of the construction of the sledge. If you look carefully at the left-hand side of the sledge, you can see the effect of the warped plywood lifting it so it doesn't lie flat on the table. Fortunately, when the support was screwed in place, this flattened this a little bit more, and in fact surprisingly had very little effect on the performance of the sledge. However, it did identify the fact that really 3/4 inch ply should be used.
Well, this is the Bosch PPS 7S pull table saw, and one of the things about it was I was looking at the sledges that you can get with saws and wondering if you could possibly use it on this saw, because it's different from other saws in the sense it hasn't got a groove or guide for the stock to go against. It works differently in that this is the stock here, which when you tighten this up, this moves back and forth. Now you can run it on both sides, as there's a slot here for this bit here to clamp onto. Now if you want to make the sledge, the first thing you've got to do is take off the guard, which is always a bit of a worrying thing. I've already done that, and I've moved this down a bit so that you can adjust the height with the guard on. Now when you've got it like this, you really want to make sure that you haven't got the saw connected to any power, because there's no guard there at all. So the first thing you would want to do, of course, is take this off, which which is a simple task. That's that removed. And I've recommended the video that you should look at for making a saw sledge for a more traditional based saw which has the grooves in the side. I thought I'd just try this out, so I had a bit of a 1/2 inch plywood around. This is what I used. If you look at it carefully you can see it's warped, but I thought when I put the bracings in I can probably flatten that pretty much, and it will give me an idea about whether it's worth buying some 3/4 inch ply. So the end result is this beast here. And instead of the slots we've got these two guides here. We need to make sure that these two slide up nicely against the edge here. So there's the sledge working properly. So this base bit is 1/2 inch ply, and this is 3 bits of 1/2 inch ply glued together, and it's pretty well has straightened it out. You can see it's still slightly warped here, that this doesn't lie down completely flat. Surprisingly that doesn't seem to make too much difference to its performance, but I think if you were going to make this again I would thoroughly recommend that you use 3/4 ply so you don't get that problem. These two bits in here are really, in my opinion, very important, because this is basically your guard. It stops you getting your fingers down where the saw is. So the saw can be obviously wound up, saw blade, which that all works okay. So what do you need to change from the excellent video that shows how to make this device? Well, the major thing is you've got to change these runners, and so instead of having a runner that will fit in the slot, you've got to have a runner which fits on the outside of the saw table. And you can see that's pretty solid, so the guides are working well. The thing we don't need to worry about the guides is we can just screw them on, and I think these ones here, if I remember rightly, when I did it, I didn't glue it. They're just screwed on, as you can see here. So that's the major difference in terms of how this is made. I left these two little bits proud because this tells you where, just helps you get the saw in place, ready to slide it. So that's the machine. I thoroughly recommend it. It's really good if you want to get 90-degree cuts on planks. I've got a chop saw, and once I go a bit wider than 8 inches I've got a problem, whereas this here would allow me to cut something that's this sort of distance. The only thing that you do need to think about when you're doing this is that if you look carefully on these bits of plastic here on the end, find that these are just stand a little bit proud, so when the sledge comes along it will catch on that and will tend to want to rip it off. So you just want to get a very fine file that down so this is completely flush here, so that the sledge will slide nicely over it. But apart from that you don't need to think about anything else. I would recommend that you always leave the sledge on the saw, that way it's put away, but also if you've got it so that it's way round. If you've got this in place, you've effectively got a guard on these pieces here. Give it a little bit more strength, but more importantly to stop you getting your hands down in that region. So you store it like this, and of course always if you've got the plug out, then it isn't going to cause any problems. So there you have it. If you have one of these saws, this is what you need to do to get a saw sledge working. So let's just see the sledge in action when we're cutting two pieces of wood that we want at the same dimension. Get a block of wood here, decide that that's the size we want things. You can then clamp it up. Then we'll hold our piece of wood in there like that. So we would adjust the saw blade just so that it's high enough up to cut what we want. Saw the first piece. I've got that hard up against the stock. Put our hands out here, well away from where it is. So that's our first piece of wood. Second piece, it should be the same size. Then we can keep our hands well away from the saw. One of the nice things with the pull saw is that instead of having to push the sledge, you can also go. The other two pieces of wood, exactly the same size. So the sledge works very nicely, even though it is very slightly bowed like this. But I think if you use a 3/4 inch plywood, that little problem will go away. But overall I'm very pleased with it. The only issue is really removing the guard. So we can just dismantle the dimension controller. Now if you want to use a sledge, then that's what you've got to do to get it back to how you want it. First of all, before doing anything, let's pull the power out. Okay, so if we take the sledge off, you replace the guard. So there's a couple of bolts go on. Now what we have done is, from the normal position for this, we've had to push it down so that this is always lower than the saw blade itself. So if you want to put the guard back on again, you've got to undo these two Allen bolts here. The saw comes with a Allen key which you can use. But it's a 10-15 minute job to put this guard back on again. So depending upon how you're going to normally use the saw, you would either leave it with the sledge on it or the guard on it, but you need one or the other. You really don't want to leave the saw like this because it's completely open. So you want to get this guard back on if you haven't got the sledge on. I think I've chosen to leave the sledge on. That means I don't have to find somewhere to put it. The thing is, we don't have to line up any slots, we just have to get it on the top of the table. There we go. And there's the guard in place. Having built the prototype, it became apparent there are a couple of issues that need to be addressed. One of them is perhaps improving the saw blade guard. In this case I've found a bit of square wire mesh which I've just put over the gap between the two pieces of wood. It would be preferable to get one with a slightly smaller mesh so that fingers can't be put through it, but certainly that gives you the idea that of the mesh which will stop you getting your fingers in from the top. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, which is actually more important I think, is that the riving blade really should always follow the saw cut so that it keeps the saw cut open and you don't get kickback. And if you look carefully at the videos of this, you can see some evidence of small kickbacks just with the simple little saws that were done. And depending upon how far the saw is wound up, either the riving blade is in place or it isn't. The way to overcome this is to put the riving blade back into the position that it is for normal cutting. This means that the actual blade itself is higher than the saw, which, looking at the saw cut, which is illustrated by the little yellow arrow, means that the saw won't go in because the riving blade gets stuck on the back. So the way is you need to increase the length of this, such as shown in this picture here, so that the riving blade can follow it through, and then no matter what adjustment you have on that saw, the riving blade is in the right position. I think this modification is very important because kickback is perhaps one of the most dangerous things that can happen with these table saws. So to do this, obviously, when we increase that slot size, we basically go right through almost all of the bracing wood at the front, at this end of the sledge. So I very simply just put another little piece of plywood on the edge like this, screwed and glued it on, and that gives it the strength to stop the board flexing any more than it is at the moment.
Clearly this needs to be thought about carefully. If you were making this again, you'd make that piece of wood a little bit higher to allow for this to happen. So in this particular case, you can run the saw right through to the back, and the upside of this as well is it also stops the blade going too far, because the blade gets caught on the back one when it hits the riving blade, or riving knife. So that's two little improvements, and the advantage of this is that the saw always has the riving blade in the right position, regardless of whether you're using the saw in the normal mode or you're using it with the sledge. So a few observations to finish with. We've presented some options for the PPS table saw. It's now arranged so that you don't need to set up anything to use the sledge. You can just use it with the settings on the riving blade or riving knife as is. Clearly there must be some opportunities for improvement, so put your thinking hats on. And really the key thing is to ensure the riving knife is correctly set for whatever you're using the saw for. This is number one importance, and you need to look at the manual to make sure that is in fact the case. This is a PS to the presentation that you've just seen, where you can see I've actually replaced the mesh that was on the saw sledge with a metal one here. I think this just is a little bit better than the previous one, although to be perfectly honest, either one is quite adequate for what's required. Having used the saw for a few weeks now, I find that I'm using this more than I am the chop saw that I have. So I really find this sledge a very useful addition to the machine. Would thoroughly recommend it to other people.